ready, Barry? Sure. Okay. Ready? Thank you for being here today. It is May the 20th, and it is the 78th birthday of Cher, and the 78th birthday of Eddie Risponi, Gary Risponi, who was a mentor to Eddie. Just like there was Sonny and Cher, there was Gary and Eddie. But happy birthday. Let's give Gary Risponi, one of the best outdoor reporters on the planet. But our guest is a former reporter, Barry Erwin. Many of us remember him in his day at WBRZ, and before that at KSLA in Shreveport. But he's a graduate of Louisiana Tech. He's been in Baton Rouge a long time, and for the last, 15 years, the president of one of the real think tanks in Louisiana, the Council for a Better Louisiana. It's a statewide nonpartisan organization working on issues that impact the quality of life in Louisiana. And there is much percolating at the Capitol, and Barry is here for an update about this and anything else on your mind. Welcome, Barry Erwin.
Thank you, sir. Well, thank you, Jim, and congratulations, Hall of Fame. Nice to be introduced by a Hall of Famer. I know a few, but you're the one I see the most often. Well, glad to be here. Obviously, legislative session going on, a lot to talk about, and I know y'all had speakers talking about some of these same issues, in previous weeks. So I'm going to try not to be totally redundant on them. Although obviously there have been developments that we've been going along through the process, and there are some things I think in particular for cable that have been on our minds a little bit, and so I'll try and emphasize some of those things a little bit. But anyway, I think it's been an interesting session to kind of watch the dynamics, the first session, kind of with this new legislature, first regular session, and the first regular session for the new governor. And I think it's been kind of a roller coaster ride, honestly, in some ways. On some of these issues, you see some of them start out in one way, they kind of get folded in or brought back to earth and some other things, and now towards the end of the session you kind of see them coming back a little bit. So it's going to be interesting to see where some of these issues fall out totally. But I'm going to talk about a few I think that were of interest to us. First of all, when the governor had the opening of the session, he really focused, to me, primarily on three issues. One of them was insurance, which we're not really involved in that too much, but that was kind of an interesting one because I think he did point out how huge of an issue it is in the state, and there's no denying that. But then he didn't really get behind and endorse a whole lot of parts of that. That's kind of been the Tim Temple show, and we have seen 3 bills, I think, on the insurance front get signed into law. I think another one is sitting at the governor's desk. So there's certainly been, some progress, at least in passing legislation in dealing with insurance issues. But these are all primarily on the property side. We have the other entire side that a lot of us are concerned about too, with the auto insurance, and we don't see a whole lot happening on that front. But at least we're seeing some movement on the property side, and whether these are going to be the solution or going to really help with the rates and the crisis that we have in so many places, we'll just have to wait and see on that. So that was one of them. The other issue that he talked about a lot is one that we've been involved with a lot in a lot of ways, dealing with education savings accounts. And we've certainly talked about that at the legislature before. This is not the first time we've talked about it. In fact, this is really the 3rd year that this subject has been on the table. But I think this is the year, with a Republican governor, with a legislature that's kind of really on board with trying to push big things through, that this was going to be really a bigger issue than it was in the past. I think you're probably all familiar with the ESAs in general. I won't get into all the details with it, but I will say this. When the legislation started out, particularly on the House side, it was pretty expansive, and I guess I would also say pretty expensive. but it really was trying to move very quickly into universal education savings accounts, which would basically mean for most parents and kids, eventually in public schools, if you had the money to do it, or in public schools or in private schools, I should say as well, there was this huge opportunity to get money from the state to pay for private school tuition. And that bill went through the House pretty easily, even though as different estimates came out, and there were several. There was a fiscal note. I think Steve at PAR put out a number. There have been some other numbers that we've seen privately that put pretty big price tags on those things. We have been supportive of ESAs in limited fashions in the past, particularly when they were targeted to areas of economically disadvantaged families, to kids in low-performing schools, that type of thing, special needs, in kind of targeted circumstances. But this is much broader than that. And we met with the administration a couple of times, just not opposed to the bill, but trying to talk about some of the concerns and issues that we thought were important. Obviously, the price tag was one that we were concerned about. But the other thing was really trying to take these dollars, if we were going to be making them available for private schools, to use them in a way that really helps our state, if we're going to do it that way, to the greatest degree possible. And for us, that meant really focusing on economically disadvantaged kids that don't have another option if they're in a public school and they wanted to move somewhere else, or kids that were really in failing schools or circumstances where they just really had no option to do things. And I'm really happy to say, at least where the legislation is now, it's kind of been through ups and downs, as I say, it is moving more in that direction. There's still a lot of detail to it. There's some things that we don't know about, quite honestly. The price tag piece is still a question mark because some of that has been taken out of it. It looks like it would be a lot less expensive than it would be under the original plan. But basically what it does do, in the first year, it would go into effect, at least as the way it's written now, for the 2025-2026 school year. And primarily, it would kind of transfer the kids in practical terms. I'm going to talk broadly because technically you can do all kinds of things, but I think in practical terms what you would see it do is transfer the kids who are in the current voucher program into the ESA program. And for the state, that really doesn't cost much money. That's really getting rid of one program, taking the dollars that are already there and kind of moving it into the ESA program. And that one's basically a wash. It also targets more kids who are already in public schools. And again, for the state fisc, that's kind of a wash because we don't know yet, because the bill doesn't describe it well enough yet, what the dollar amounts would be for the parents in the schools. We had some idea in the earlier bills, but in this one we don't the way it's written right now. But basically you'd still be kind of transferring public dollars that are already there in the MFP to some in private schools, and it's unclear just how much that would be. It would certainly have an impact on some local school districts, but in terms of the state, it probably would not be that huge of a cost. The other part of it is it targets, or it tries to target families at 250% of the poverty level or below. Now, in Louisiana, that's a pretty significant number. That's around $78,000 or so for a family of four. So in Louisiana, that impacts a lot of kids. So that would even impact some that might already be in private schools. But the big issue about the whole thing is it's subject to appropriation. The legislature can decide how much money to put in there and how much they're not going to put in there. And it also leaves it to Bessie in this particular piece of the legislation to decide what they're going to do in terms of how to figure out what to do if you don't have enough money. It's kind of silent in the bill right now, and it's actually been silent all the way through the process. So, we know what happens with charter schools. If you want to get into this charter school and there's a waiting list, they have lotteries, they have all that type of stuff. But we don't know that about how that's going to work on this bill. So it leaves it up to Bessie quite a bit to try and promulgate rules around the program. And it seems to me, looking at it, there's a lot of flexibility in what they could do in making those decisions. But the point I make out of all this is, if this legislation passes, and I presume that it will, there are still going to be a lot of question marks that we don't know the answers to, because it's still going to fall under the purview of Bessie to kind of figure out how some of those things are going to work, and the legislature as well to determine how much money are they going to put into the program. And the last thing I would say on this is it seems like there's a pretty long runway on the real implementation of this bill if it passes. The first year, they do want to start in 25-26, as I mentioned, But again, that's going to be mostly transferring voucher kids into the ESA program. In the initial legislation, it talked about years. There would be year 1, year 2, and year 3, and certain things would happen in each of those years. In the bill now, it doesn't say year 1, year 2, year 3. It says year 1 for the vouchers, but after that it says phase 2 and phase 3. And so there's no timeline on those things. So my point is that we could see this having a very long runway. We know what's going to happen next year with the budget in terms of the sales tax rolling off and the vehicle sales tax moving into the Transportation Trust Fund. So on top of trying to figure out maybe some of the details on this ESA program, we're also going to be looking very closely at the budget. So we'll see where all of this goes, but I guess the bottom line is I think this has gone from a very expansive and expensive program into one that's been reined in quite a bit with a lot of detail and a lot of questions, a lot of detail left out so far and a lot of questions yet to be answered. So the third kind of big issue that the governor talked about, and I'm not going to get into this a lot because Steve was here a couple of weeks ago about the Constitutional Convention, but I think you kind of know where that stands right now. We've got legislation passed the House waiting, and still, as far as I know, has not been scheduled in the Senate committee yet. We've only got a couple of weeks left. A number of things have been taken off the table for discussion in the Constitutional Convention. As you know, the MFP, the homestead exemption, and then we got the sheriffs, the DAs, the centralized sales tax, which, as you know, is a big issue, retirement systems, what else? Supplemental pay, quite a number of things have sort of been taken off the table. But the big question, of course, is can you really take them off the table? And I think that's the question that's still kind of percolating the minds of a lot of people in the Senate. It was kind of interesting to me the other day to see the governor talking about the ESA bill and then using the Constitutional Convention argument as a reason to have the Constitutional Convention so we could get money to fund the ESAs. Now, he wasn't terribly specific about, how that would happen. He did mention, I think, the Tobacco Trust Fund, the settlement fund. But then some of his own allies said, well, we can open up the MFP and then use those dollars to fund the ESAs. So I'm not sure that was exactly the message that he wanted to get out in terms of trying to push for the Constitutional Convention. But that's now been thrown on the table again in one way or another, and it remains to be seen whether that's the intent or not. But I think the idea behind that was that we do have a lot of special funds in the Constitution that are dedicated, they are tied up, and certainly there is a desire that the legislature has, because of budget cuts and everything else, to try and be able to open some of those things up and see what happens. What's going to happen with this? I mean, right now, my sense is if you asked senators right now if they wanted to have this Constitutional Convention, or right now, or at least in the foreseeable future, the majority would probably say no, they don't want to have it. Does that mean that it's not going to pass? I don't think you can equate those two things, honestly, because I don't think you can underestimate the influence of the governor, particularly when this is a priority. I don't think you can underestimate the different approaches you can take to kind of thread the needle to make it acceptable to people in the Senate, but also get a win and actually, have a convention at some point. But we don't know what that's going to look like at this point right now. But again, I don't say there's a big appetite in the Senate for it at this moment, but at the same time, I would say I'm not going to bet against that there might be a convention at some point in the future. So those are the big three areas in that piece that the governor talked about. As you know, we're involved a lot in education, so I did want to talk about some other things in education besides the ESAs that I think are of interest to us, and I think actually are pretty much on the encouraging side. It hadn't gotten a lot of attention, but there's some bills that are moving through that I think are actually good policy things that are going to help our students, particularly in areas where we are struggling with our kids right now. In particular, I'd focus on 2 or 3 bills that deal with tutoring, high-dosage tutoring, expanding opportunities for that. Other ones that deal particularly with trying to improve math, particularly in the early ages of kids. We all know a couple of years ago we were highlighting the fact that our kids on reading were doing so poorly, that they were actually going down, which is something, you see kids plateau, you see maybe slight increase, but you don't see our scores really going down the way that we actually were just a few years ago in terms of early literacy. And of course, we looked at Mississippi, we looked at some of the things they did to have their scores going up, and so we made a bunch of changes in the last couple of years dealing with early literacy. And we're starting to see some results there, it seems to me, and that's very encouraging. So what we're trying to do now is kind of take some of those lessons learned a little bit from the early reading and apply those to early math. And so that's what some of the legislation we have going through the process right now does. I think it's really positive and a good sign that we're focusing on policies in this case that really hopefully can make a difference for our kids in these critical early areas. Also, K-12, I'd have to mention, we're still talking about teacher pay raises. We're still talking about early childhood education. I think it was disappointing to see that the House passed a budget that actually reduced the stipend, it's not even a pay raise, for teachers from last year, the $2,000 average that we had, to about $1,700. Also to see about $24 million cut out of early childhood education, which would affect directly about 2,000 kids that were receiving services now, but would not if that cut were to go into place. I think it's pretty clear that the House was, not wanting or favoring to do that and was looking for the Senate to restore it. And I think all indications that we get is that the Senate is probably going to be able to restore those things, and that's very positive. But I do think from our perspective, it was kind of unfortunate for the House that when the budget got tight on that side of things, we looked to education, we looked to early childhood education, teacher pay as areas that at least ostensibly we could cut for a period of time. I mean, I think it sends a difficult message to our teachers and to our families when we know education is so important, when we know early childhood is something that really makes a difference in the lives of kids, not just in those early ages, but all the way through life, that we felt like that was an area that could be cut, at least temporarily, while we waited for other funding on the other side. So be that as it may, I mean, I'm encouraged by the fact that I think the Senate is going to restore that. But it doesn't bode well to me for the future when I think we're going to see more budget cuts coming, obviously, with the sales tax rolling off and more difficult budget circumstances, to see that early childhood and some of these things may be the ones first on the cutting block, at least in some areas. Also on the education front, real quickly, we're big supporters of charter schools, and there's some positive legislation going through there. Charter schools in our state are about 30 years old. It's a 30-year anniversary. We haven't done a big update at all of our charter school law over the years. So we're actually doing some right now that I think will kind of bring it up to date to where it needs to be, and also do some things to expand some opportunities in a couple of areas for charter schools, and I think that's a really positive thing. In higher ed, a couple of things I would point to that I think, again, are positive. One, as you probably know, in Louisiana, we're the only state in the country when it comes to tuition and fees that it takes a 2/3 vote of the legislature to make any adjustment in either tuition or fees. And we haven't done much of that in recent years. We've had some opportunities to do that on a limited basis in the past, primarily in the area of fees, not so much tuition. But the legislation that's going through right now, I think, is something that can be very positive for higher ed in a broad way. And this is not about giving overall tuition authority to the colleges and universities, but it's to kind of focus in on a differential tuition for high-cost programs. And this is one of the things that's really impacting our universities right now. We've got programs that are high demand, the ones that create, well-paying jobs. We're talking engineering, architecture, electrical, a variety of things that are ones where employers want employees, where people go into those fields, they can make a good bit of money, but they're very expensive for the universities to provide those things, and yet they're all bundled up into the same tuition price. So if you're taking, an English major or an engineering major, you're paying the same amount, even though the cost of those programs is so different compared to one another. So this would basically allow universities on a limited basis, and also our community and technical colleges, to increase tuition up to 10% over a 2-year period in these high-cost programs. And I think the thing that's interesting on this part, too, it's not the overall tuition, it's just the cost of those courses. So if you're in an engineering program and you're taking English and basic math, algebra, all those things, you'd still be paying the bottom level tuition. Where your tuition might go up is really only when you get to those higher level, more expensive engineering courses or architectural courses or whatever they might be. So it's not as big of a tuition increase as people think. It's really kind of more of a market-driven approach, I think, where these high-cost programs that yield, high salaries in the end are able to pay for themselves better than they are in terms of the way it is right now. And the other thing, and I know people are kind of holding their breath thinking, yeah, right, this is going to happen. But I actually think it might in some areas. This legislation also gives the colleges, the technical colleges, and universities the ability to lower tuition if they choose to, because they can't do that right now. And you say, yeah, they're not going to do that. Well, I think the truth is you may actually see this if this legislation passes, because particularly in our community and technical college systems, our tuition is kind of high in those. We know it's high compared to other states. And I think there's a desire to kind of bring those rates down if you can in some of these lower cost areas. So if you've got a high cost program kind of paying for itself, which it's not doing right now, it does create an opportunity to kind of lower tuition in some of these other programs. And I'd say the same thing in our universities, particularly in things like education, where we are really trying to bring prospective teachers, prospective educators into the profession. We're recruiting now more than we ever have and reaching out. But if we could reduce the cost a little bit, say in education programs, that might be another thing that encourages folks who are interested in the education field to actually go in there and take part in that and graduate and hopefully get into the classroom as teachers. Moving on just to one other area, Steve was here the other day. Been a lot of discussion about the public records laws. I'm not going to get into that because I think PAR did a great job and is working really hard on that, and we've seen pretty much the tide turn on that, and it's kind of going away. But I do want to talk about one last thing that is kind of concern to us, that's not in the exact same area, but it's flown a little bit below radar, and we'd like to get it back on the radar a little bit higher. And that has to do with the governor's appointments to boards and commissions. If you look at the legislation that was filed this session, there were about 5 bills that, if you looked at them all together, really increased the power of the governor to make appointments across state government, including the judiciary. The good news is, out of those 5, I think only 3 have had some movement. But any one of them by themselves would, I think, probably be considered significant. And now we've got 3 that are still in play. I think it's kind of interesting. We did a little research when we were working on this. And I found this interesting quote from our governor, former Governor Erwin, who was writing in the Journal of the Louisiana Historical Association a number of years ago about the power that the governor has in Louisiana compared to other states. And the point that he made in there was that, governors in all states have powers, and then they vary from one state to the other. But he says it's really hard to argue. He said, I think historians of Louisiana politics would not argue that the governor's powers in Louisiana are greater than they are in most other states. And the reason he said that was because the governor of Louisiana has so much authority to appoint people to so many boards and commissions. We have almost 500 of them. The governor makes appointments, not every member, but appointments to virtually all of those things of one variety or the other. And when you put all of those together, that's a tremendous amount of power. So there's 3 bills that have kind of been working through the process on that. One of them deals with civil service, and that's a constitutional amendment. And while it's still moving, I'm kind of thinking it's about to run out of time on that one because it's a constitutional amendment, number 1. Number 2, it's been recommitted to another committee, and we'll see what happens. But I think that one maybe is going to take care of itself. There's another one that started out as a bill to allow the governor to appoint the chairs and officers of basically any board or commission in the state. Now think about that. Some of these commissions, the governor doesn't even get an appointment to, or he gets 1 or 2. But this would allow him to appoint the officers and the chairs of virtually every board and commission in the entire state. That is a pretty broad expansion of power. Now, what's happened is the Senate kind of reined that in quite a bit. It's kind of limited the scope of that to a large degree, and it's not nearly as broad and as expansive as it was when it started. However, that bill is going to be up in committee tomorrow, and we're hearing things that some of those amendments that the Senate put on may be taken off, and we'll see where that may go. But that's definitely one that we've been looking at closely, and particularly as it regards to higher education, because there are things to worry about with accreditation, with other issues that are really, concerning about having that power invested in a governor, any governor really, to appoint the chairs, particularly the chairs right now, the way the legislation is, of the higher education boards. But the one that's really of major concern at this moment deals with the ethics board. And I want to tell you about that one real quickly, and I want you to think about this one too. If there's any board or commission in our state that we want to be very sensitive about or think twice before we really make changes there, I think the ethics board would be one of them. What we have now with the appointments to the ethics board is that there are 11 members. The governor appoints 7 of them, and the legislature appoints 4. That's the way it is right now. But it's a 2-step process, because the governor and the legislature don't just make direct appointments. They appoint them from a list of 5 people for each position that have been vetted and nominated basically by the presidents of the independent colleges in our state. So that's basically the private institutions, Tulane, Xavier, Loyola, Dillard, those types of institutions, where we kind of took a step back and said, instead of making these purely political appointees, we're going to get this independent group that really doesn't have a lot of skin in the game when it comes to, being overseen by the ethics board. They're not public servants. We're going to let them make these nominations from stakeholders around the state, from each congressional district, vet them, look for, overt political influences and that type of thing, make those nominations to the governor and the legislature, and then let them make those appointments out of that list. That is a process that we've had in place for more than 2 decades. I would argue it has served us really well. A number of you people are media folks, past media. I don't think you can think real easily about the last time we had a big controversy about appointments to the ethics board because of the political nature of this process. So I think it's a process that has worked very well over the years. What's happening now is this bill started in the Senate, it's gotten through the House Governmental Affairs Committee, and now it's going to be on the floor probably this week to really allow the governor and the legislature to make these appointments directly. We really feel like this is a step in the wrong direction. And I have to be very clear, for us, this is not about this governor. Our organization has been around for more than 60 years, and for some reason, because we're so old, and I'm getting old too, we have a tendency, when we're thinking about the future, to look forward, but also to look backwards. And I think if you look back at our past and look at why we have done certain things, why we put in certain guardrails in place, certain speed bumps and protections, we've done it because of a reason. And the fact that we sort of have a legacy of political shenanigans, corruptions, and all those things, certainly tells us why we try to be very careful with a vetting 2-step process and appointing people to the ethics board. We think it'd be a really wrong direction, not just for this governor, but really one of the things we look at too is trying to look to the future. And a lot of times the legislature comes in, new folks, new governor, there's a lot of enthusiasm. You look at the circumstances, you look at philosophies, and you say, I don't think it's a big deal to make this change. I mean, look, we're headed in the right direction. But we don't look at it just in the short term. We look at it in the long term as well. And for us, if we can envision a time, and we would think the legislature ought to do this too, where you see a future governor or you see circumstances that are different than what they are now, and regret that maybe we made some of these changes, or wonder if this governor in the future might abuse these privileges that we're expanding right now, it's probably not a good idea to do it. And that's kind of where we're coming from on this. So it's pretty far along in the process. It's gotten kind of below radar for a while, but we really hope the legislature will try to put the brakes on some of these things. Again, we put these safeguards and guardrails in place, not because we're trying to make government more difficult to work, but basically because we don't want to concentrate power too much in any one individual or any one office, whatever the case may be. So we're hopeful. Hopefully that'll be on y'all's radar too as we go forward, and I guess we'll see what happens this week. But with that, those are kind of the issues that we're involved with, again, on the education side, and, again, with these appointees and constitutional conventions. So with that, I will stop, and if y'all have any questions about anything, I'm glad to try and answer any questions from our perspective. So. Oh, Gary.
Somebody's not here, man. Where can we get for or your opinion, y'all got a website, where y'all make recommendations or y'all thoughts on everything in the legislation?
Yeah, he was
How
at.
can you find that?
Yeah, he was asking about where you could find the kind of recommendations we make in PAR, and certainly they are on our website. Ours is just CABL, CABL.org. I can't remember exactly what PAR's is, but they're pretty easy to Google. They've been putting out quite a few things lately, and we have too. The other thing I'll say, if you're interested in our stuff, we have a little newsletter thing that we call Cable Wire, which if you do go to our website, you can subscribe for free, of course. We don't bombard you with stuff all the time, but really they're kind of commentaries and perspectives, you know, on some of these issues, which hopefully we give you some background on them and kind of some food for thought about context and thoughts on these things in kind of a commentary way. So if you're interested in that, certainly you can go to our website and sign up for that for free. Yes.
I think there two more components to the public records that are still alive in the legislature. I know you didn't want to address that, but I'd rather them not change anything.
Yeah, there were three bills basically that were the main ones, and one was really pretty comprehensive, particularly with the, well, I say it was the governor's stuff to start with, but it was really much broader than that, got even into local government. So that was one. And then there were two more that dealt kind of with Louisiana citizens being able to access things. One just said you had to be a Louisiana citizen originally, and the other said you had to have an ID to do that. What ended up happening at the end, all three of those bills were kind of combined into one bill because they were dealing with all the public records, but then the author killed that bill. So that one that brought them all together is dead. But then the two other bills are still floating out there in varying form. I mean, what we're hearing from the leadership in the Senate is those are probably dead for the session, that they're going to stay on the calendar. I mean, anything is possible, but the signals is that those things are probably dead. Although I don't know that Senator Miguez himself, who had the one about the photo ID requirement to access public records, I don't know that he said per se that that he's killing that bill or not. But the indications we get are that those are probably off the table for this session. But we'll see in 2 weeks. Yes.
About the car inspection thing, that's still on the table?
You know, I haven't kept up with that one totally. I'm not sure where that one stands. That's. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's not one that we've been involved with, except what I've seen in the paper and all that. So anything that's going to cost money likely is having a difficult time. Yeah, I mean, we pay those fees for getting those things done, and a lot of those fees are dedicated to things or sent to different deals. And if that one was going to cost state police money, you can bet that that was one that people were going to take their eyes off of and say, not so fast. Yeah.
One about the red light cameras giving you tickets for running.
I think that one's pretty much dead, isn't it? If y'all, I mean, it passed, was it last year, or it was under the last term with Senator Cortez, who was the president of the Senate, and a Lafayette resident, going back and forth, and also with the DOTD people really trying to do that to get the traffic slowed down on there. But then we fast forward into this year, and you've got local sheriffs who are not so much in favor of it, think that they can handle things on their own. And I think that one has run into some difficulty in terms of kind of making it all the way through the process.
Well, I was going to say, excuse me. So obviously there's only so much they can do on the revenue side in a non-fiscal session. Have you seen any indication that lawmakers are starting to plan for next year's fiscal clip?
Oh, yeah. Any indication that lawmakers are starting to plan for next year's fiscal clip? I'm trying to think here for some specific things. First off, I would say in a broad sense, for sure. I mean, just about every bill that has even a small price tag on it has been going through either the Finance Committee or the Appropriations Committee to take a look at those things to see what their impact on the budget is. I think they have tried to be very, very sensitive to any legislation that would be coming up new this year, no matter how worthy it was, and many of them I think are very, very worthy, but adding to that budget without a revenue stream to it, or at least saying it's subject to appropriations in the future. We're certainly seeing that on some of these education bills that I mentioned, not the ESAs, but really with some of the things dealing with tutoring is one that comes to mind, where there's some federal dollars that are still available that can be used to kind of do this for a period of time, but they're not permanent, and they would still be subject to appropriation in the future. So I think, broadly speaking, they are very cognizant of where they're going to be next year in terms of the budget. And I don't see a whole lot of new big spending on a recurring basis that's pushing through there. And I think if you look at the teacher pay issue, that's kind of a good example of that, because I think there was a pretty good desire, especially last year after it was only a one-year stipend, to say we're going to come back and make it a full teacher pay raise. You know, and yet the governor didn't do it, and the legislature didn't try to do that again this year. So I think they are very, very cognizant of the situation next year, and trying to put the brakes as much as they can on adding any new spending to the budget that they're really going to have a problem with next year.
I have a question about the tuition differential plan. How does that work with TOPS then? If everybody gets the same amount, but if you're going for engineering, it doesn't pay as much, or if you're going for history, it pays.
Well, how does that differential tuition affect TOPS? Well, at the end of the day, it actually doesn't, because I think people, because we've been funding it and it hadn't been an issue lately, kind of forget, essentially, a number of years ago, in the Jindal years when the budget was so tight, we essentially put a cap on TOPS. So really, everybody will get the same amount that they're getting. And it differs by institution, I should say that. But whatever that TOPS amount is, every student will get the same amount. So it doesn't necessarily cover everybody's tuition 100%, even the way it is right now. It's capped, and that cap would stay there. So at least for the legislature part, and in terms of additional spending because of TOPS, there will be no additional spending on TOPS because of increasing the tuition in some of those programs. But for students, what it would mean is they may have a tuition that goes up that would not be covered anymore by TOPS.
I had a question about the various efforts, boards and commissions, open records law, the various things that have been, you know, this is the first year with the supermajority and a friendly governor, in essence. And so far it has seemed like it's just been a game of whack-a-mole. This pops up and you have to hit it down. Are we pretty much guaranteed that at least the next 4 years are going to be the game of whack-a-mole?
Are we guaranteed that the next 4 years are going to be the game of whack-a-mole, where these proposals come up and then the legislature reacts, I guess is what you're saying to it? You know, I tend to think, I don't know if it's totally that. I'll give you what my thought is on it. I think when you have a new governor and a new legislature, particularly the legislature when they have been under, the ones who have been here before, under 8 years of a Democrat as governor, and they've seen themselves pass things that either the governor vetoed or threatened to veto, and they didn't get through the process for one reason or another. It was kind of like the dam broke, you know. All these things that had this pent-up demand, they've been passing them through. And you can look across the board, there's a number of those things that we've seen the last 2 or 3 years that didn't get real traction, particularly on some social issues where you're seeing quite a bit of traction, and those things are going. You also see, I think, with some of these other proposals, and I'll use the ESAs as an example, where you know there was this enthusiasm at the beginning, and then it's kind of like reality check that comes in. My sense is that we're experiencing a lot of that right now, a lot of you know, deference to the governor, which you would expect coming in with you know, getting elected, particularly in the primary and that type of thing. But at the end of the day, as things go along, the legislature realizes that they are the legislature, and it is a multi-branch of government, and I think these kind of balances begin to kick in. And we've seen it in the past. I'm not saying this is anything for this governor or whatever. If you think about it, when Governor Jindal came in the first term, especially, there was the same kind of enthusiasm in a lot of ways, but at the end of the second term, the legislature felt a little differently about things. So I think part of it is the natural process that you go through of the give and take, where the governor feels like there's certain things he wants to do. He wants the legislature to jump on board. He gets as many of them as he can at the beginning. But after a while, that balance kind of begins to kick in again. So I think we'll find a balance over the next couple of years on some of those things. I think that's kind of the natural process. But it's been kind of interesting to watch as it's gone through that process. Yes.
General discussion within the walls of the legislature with the governor trying to exert and take over so much power and have so much incompetence of what's going on. What's the vibration in the walls of the legislature?
So the question is, what are the vibrations within the walls of the legislature with the governor trying to accrue more authority in that type of things? That's a good question. I tend to think that this new legislature coming in particular, and particularly on the House side, where you've got a lot of new folks coming in, they want, they support the governor. They want to help the governor get his agenda passed. They want to be on, the governor's side on a lot of these things. They don't want to be against the governor. I think in some cases they do have some concerns about some things, but I think particularly with some of the new people, they're trying to kind of find their way. Pick your fights, if you want to call it that. A lot of them are new. They're still trying to figure out exactly how I can, put my views forward on this, maybe put the brakes on this a little bit, or get my, viewpoint across without crossing lines. Now, in the Senate, it's a little bit different because, one, they have bigger districts. Most of them have been there for longer periods of time. They feel a greater insulation, and that body is just a different chamber than the House is, partially because of its size, but partially because of its experience as well. So I think that's what you do see going on over there. But I do think there are folks that are a little concerned, particularly with the boards and commissions, about too much of an overreach. Because I do think some people have institutional memory, not just in the last few years, but really going back in time as well, about why we did certain things. So I think that's why when you look at some of the things that you've seen go through the process, you've seen them start out really big, you see them contract a little bit, now they're kind of maybe bouncing back a little bit. And then at the end of the day, I think we'll find some balance between, that more narrow area that we've gotten into. But I do think it's a learning process for legislators. I think the first year it's really hard for these new folks to, even know where they're going or what they're expected to do. And there's a lot of pressure on them when the governor or the speaker or the president or whoever it might be, might say we really need this or whatever. But, they tend to get their wings, eventually on things. And I think you see by the end of a term, it's kind of a different world than it was at the beginning of a term, or at least that's the way it's been to me, my observation in the past. Yes.
Does CABL have a policy position with the steady slide of government services to public-private entities?
Do we have a position on slide from public entities to funding for private things? I would say not per se. I mean, I think there are opportunities in both things, and we're going to hear a lot more about it, I really do believe, over the next couple of years, or see it in terms of reorganization in some of these agencies where there is some more reaching out to the private sector to do things. I wouldn't say from CABL's perspective we have a particular broad view on that. I think it's more of a case-by-case basis to see if this kind of thing makes sense. I mean, I would go back to a big issue in the past when the hospital situation where we had the state-run facilities and now basically they're privately run. I mean, I think we felt like that was a good idea, that there was more opportunity to serve people, in a better, broader way through the private sector than, large bureaucracy in the public sector in buildings that were the state was not reinvesting in and were really not up to speed by any standard. So I think that's an area where we felt like that made sense and was good. But I'm certain that there are other areas where I think that we would kind of hold our breath a little bit more. But I think it's a case-by-case basis. John.
Has there been any legislation or vibrations from the legislature about easing the reporting requirements of lobbyists?
Easing the reporting requirements for lobbyists. I got to go back and think. I don't know about the reporting requirements. I think there's to lower some of the fee, or not the fees, the penalties for late filing and some of those things. I do believe that legislation is still, I think it's still alive. That's the main one that comes to mind. But I don't know about any things to kind of rein in the reporting requirements. Not aware, or I haven't kept up with that part, I should say. Not saying it's not there, but I do know there's something about the penalties and if you're overdue, which are kind of high. Yeah.
On the ESAs, and trying to get them to, I guess, the people who need them the most. One of the problems with the Fortified Roof program they found subsequently was that people of means accessed the system just like that, and people who really could have benefited were shut out. How do you prevent that from happening with these ESAs?
That's a great question. She was asking about on the ESAs, even if you're trying to target it, the program to people who need it the most, oftentimes you look at other programs, she's mentioned Fortified Roofs, where people of means were able to access those dollars more quickly or more easily, and the folks that really needed it financially were kind of shut out of it. You know, for us, that has been one of the issues that we have had with the ESA program, because even in the original piece, it did not describe how, you know, if you have a shortage of funds, how they were going to be allocated. It was silent on that, and basically it left it to Bessie to make a decision. Now, we've been through different iterations of that, and actually that's kind of where it's ended up again right now, is the legislation says Bessie will have to make rules that deal with that. I think that's a difficult part of it, because I think when it was really in the broad sense, like after about 3 years, it would have really been universal. And if my kids were in private school, I had access to whatever process just the way anybody else would. That's been reined in a bit in the process now. And actually what they're saying in the third phase of things, which is not necessarily the third year, but the third phase, that even though it's kind of technically universal, it's supposed to prioritize students with special needs and families at 250% or below the poverty level. So Bessie would have to kind of come up with a mechanism of how to allocate those limited dollars, but with the direction of the legislature saying those are the two areas that you have to prioritize. I mean, for me, I think I'm encouraged from CABL's perspective in that the big ESA program that we thought of that was really going to, you know, take a lot of money from the state and just subsidize families that were already of means and already had their kids in private schools. I don't think that's going to happen with the way this is. Now, that said, Bessie is going to have to come up with some kind of a process, I think, that really defines how you are going to prioritize those. But I think that was a really big concern initially, because the way that bill was crafted, it just kind of left it wide open. Kind of was implying first come, first serve. Well, first come, first serve is basically for those who probably have, you know, the knowledge, the access, the means to figure out how you get there first, versus those families that don't have that ability to the same degree. Yeah.
What gives you gives y'all the feeling that it won't happen that way, where those people who are financially aided, know the system, won't be able to reach in and get those funds more quickly and make it more available than other folks? What gives you that feeling?
Well, I think because at least the way that it's crafted right now, it does seem to try and prioritize special needs students and those at 250% or below the poverty level. Now, it says prioritize. It doesn't say you can't get it. So that is a good point. So for our perspective, as a group that is concerned about the folks, in our view, that need it the most financially or in schools where they really ought to have, if they can, an opportunity for something else, that means step 2 for us is that we have to work with Bessie. So I don't know that the legislature is going to define that any further than what they are in this legislation right now. We'll see. There's still a few days left to do that. But what it tells me is that we have an opportunity to go to Bessie and kind of make those feelings known, just actually the way we did with the administration and others. And I think there's a broad sense, honestly, that that's the right way to do it. I mean, if you think about it, if what we're trying to do is do a couple of things. One, help students, give them choices that they wouldn't have otherwise. But in the bigger picture, I'd say what we're trying to do in education is to lift our state. And so if we are just paying for kids who are already in a private school, who are going to do fine, are going to go to college, do whatever, that doesn't expand the pool of kids that are going to get into the workforce, that are going to get into other, technical training, college training, whatever, to do whatever. So what we feel like is that not only do we want to help these kids, we want to help these kids who otherwise wouldn't have that opportunity to grow all the way through that educational process. And putting money into families that frankly are already going to be fine and their kids are already going to go to college and have great careers, that doesn't help with our workforce needs. It doesn't help educate our population any more than it already is. And I think others probably see that too. That's my hope. All right, thanks.